Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about literature, history, and general cultural things in Canada. Today, I'm obviously joined by my usual co-host with the most, Mac. And my name is Patrick, for those who somehow joined the show on the 72nd episode or whatever that we're making. So cool, good on you for joining then. Official episode that doesn't include the interviews and all that, so it's more like 100 and something. Yeah. Today we actually have a guest with us because we felt like, the two white men talking about a variety of things just kind of got old after a while, surprisingly enough.
Let's not be the only ones to talk about feminism.
So, as you could tell from the title of the episode, today we're going to be talking about the starting years of women's suffrage in Canada. And we figured that we would have a guest with us, someone that we've heard on the background of the show quite often, sometimes making comments or making smoothies in the background.
Often mentioned.
The person I live with. Yeah. Camille, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Camille. There you go. Bye. No, seriously. I'm also a PhD student in literature who focuses in narrative medicine, but I have an interest in feminism. But I want to specify here that he just said that he didn't want to have two white guys in introducing this show, but I am a white woman, so it's not that much better. At least there's a different sex on the show today.
Yeah, the intersectionality is still pretty bad.
I mean, to be fair, considering what we're going to be talking about today, there's not a lot of colored people or just ethnic minorities. I have to mention that going off.
Yeah.
Surprising as it may seem, a lot of 19th century feminists were not interested in Asian women or Black women. They did exist and they did have their own movements and their own rights, but yeah, that's a thing. So I guess I want to start with a question here. Mac, what are your thoughts on women's rights?
Important? I don't.
Good answer.
I know we've probably played the joke. We make the joke ourselves, but I don't know. Whatever you want me to call myself, ally to feminism, a feminist, I am. Whatever people's preferred terminology for me to call myself, I am that. I'm not gonna try and be like, oh, I'm an equalist. Like, that's dumb. That's a red flag, first of all. For anybody who's curious, that's a fucking red flag and a half. Call yourself a feminist or ally to feminism, whatever the people around, whatever the women prefer you call yourself that. I've grown up that way. I grew up very much, not to say my dad was always around, but like my aunts, my cousins most of my cousins are female that I was around. So then I was always just around women in the household. And that sort of, I was raised that way very strongly through matriarchs and, I don't know, women ideals. I don't know.
Matriarchs is such an interesting term. I was raised by matriarch. Do you feel like you were that the leadership in the family was primarily female?
That one's one to unpack. And also, because I have to remember my mother listens to this, so whatever I say I get an earful of later. But it was much more, the decision making was always the two of them, and in the decisions of the actual household or whatever, it was again like she did, because she handles all the finances of the family. Like, yeah, my dad makes the money, it all comes into that, but he has no idea what happens with it. He has no idea what's happening with like the investments, the housing, the taxes, nothing. Meanwhile, my mother has a brain like a goddamn ledger, and she just goes and she makes all the calls she has planned 20 steps ahead, And there was a really funny story about this actually, where my dad is out because he's a businessman, so he goes out on business dinners and he's talking with the other guys there. And the other guy's like, yeah, they're talking about their money and they're talking about how they have like their own little separate things that the wives don't handle. Meanwhile, my dad messaged my mother before it is like, hey, I'm gonna spend this amount for the dinner. Is that okay? And she was like, yes.
It's not feminism. I don't know what is. The women control the money.
I don't know if I would necessarily call that feminism. It's just like an understood relationship here.
Yeah.
But
it's
sure.
For sure.
I mean,
the decision
Pat, your
making
mom
has
is
always
like
been
that too.
pretty equal, I guess. I don't know.
For sure. And yes, to answer your question, Kimmy, my mom is exactly like that. And my mom doesn't really listen to the show, so I can say that. And there's going to be no earful. But no, 100%. And yeah, aside, it was a joke question, kind of to start off the episode in this case. But I don't think anyone here is going to be actively like anti-women's rights. I think we're all on the same page on this one, to say the least. But I think
Well, I don't know. I asked about this. Like, should women have the right to... For those of you who don't know me, that was a joke.
Yes, she's very strongly like Camille, whatever you want to say. Call her
Just
whatever.
call
She's
me
a woman.
Cam.
It doesn't
Just
matter.
call me. Wow. No, just call me Cam. It's fine. It's going to be easier for your male brain. Just call me Cam.
So yeah, it's very much she knows women's rights much better than we do. That's why we have her here.
Yes, a more serious question to start us off in this case is, when we think of the beginning of women's suffrage, like what kind of bases are we working with in this case? I know obviously we've read the notes in this case, or we've read parts of the reading material that is obviously going to link for listeners. It's available for free. And yeah, just going into this, like what were your thoughts or expectations in this kind of time period that we're talking about in the late 19th roughly century women's movements in Canada? Either of you can start.
Well, I'll start.
Yeah, cool.
I'll start.
Ladies first.
There you go. Such a gentleman. I mean, I think that what's interesting about this particular section of this episode is the fact that we're talking about Canada. I know it's a bit of an obvious answer here, but within feminist discourse, we talk so much about how the United States obtained suffrage and the suffragette movement in the UK as well, that we don't spend too much time on Canada. And I think Canada has an interesting history in terms of how women got the right to vote and how sporadically it happened also. It kind of happened very late in certain sections, like here in Quebec, for example, women got the right to vote really, really late in history. Yeah, so I think it's interesting also, but it's just from the notes that you had brought up, the fact that some of these women, probably most of these women, were not only middle class, but also big fans of eugenics, kind of complicates the question a lot, which was not uncommon in the US and the UK either, but it's going to be a fun, or at least an interesting way to look at it, but we'll get to that later.
And Mac, how about you? And did you have anything in particular that you were thinking of or bringing into this episode?
Honestly, it's very similar to Cam, where my conception was very much US, UK centered and focused. I mean, obviously I knew, like she was saying, that in Canada it was very sporadic in the province. It was not a unified movement here. And again, certain places came in much later than others, and it also just, I could probably take a guess that it was all very handled in a very Canada way. Problems swept under the rug, that sort of stuff, all those fun things. And also just the other part I remember of women's rights is how women were originally brought to Canada when it was a French colony. What were they called again? Young girls brought over. Oh boy. Oof.
It's feminism for you.
Feminist. Side note, I always have to remind myself specifically of what eugenics means, just to remind myself how fucking nuts it is. God.
Yeah, we'll get into it more towards the end of the episode when we talk about some of the people that were like specific people that we're going to be talking about, specific writings. But yeah, unfortunately, the history of race relations is an intrinsic part of gender relations in Canada, and as you were saying, like in the UK and United States and probably everywhere else in the world at this point on some level. I don't think that's specific to North America or Western countries. This might be a very generalized statement on my part, but I don't think it's that much of a stretch to think of it that way. But yeah, I guess going into it, I remember, and this is one of the sources I am including in the show notes in this case, there was a book that was written in 1950 by Catherine Cleverdon called The Women's Suffrage Movement in Canada, which I think we have a paper copy of in the big pile you have in our room, Camille. But I remember that book, despite its age, like often when we look at historical texts from 75 years ago at this point, they tend not to have aged super well. But I remember reading that one and being like, this is surprisingly good, right? And so it's a surprisingly like good overview of how the suffrage movement was achieved. It doesn't talk a lot about the race relation aspect that we're going to be talking about, but that's to be expected from a book from 1950. But still, like the underlying white woman's middle class movement is, I think, pretty well handled in this sense. And I remember it being very interesting because Cleverdon brings up some really, I think, important things to keep in mind about how women themselves viewed the movement internally and how these movements were also responding to things that were removed from them actively, right, as rights. That this, people or women used to have rights in Canada and then were removed and then they had to be fought for again, which I think is something that we can maybe start by talking about, was the early days before the actual suffrage movement, right? And I guess I'll just go into it, and if you have anything to add, we can kind of go from there in this case. But as in the early 19th century, in what was then called British North America, right, the later lands of Canada, there were signs of women actually voting in these areas. So roughly southern Ontario to the Maritimes, right? And we know from records, because it would have been very public, right, who voted, that at least 27 Kanien'kehá:ka women from Kanawake cast ballots in an 1825 election. So that's doubly impressive because not only were they women, but they were Indigenous women. And some Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish women also voted in Quebec elections, which is also funny considering what Camille was saying, that women's right to vote in Quebec was only achieved really less than 100 years ago, which is madness to think about. But obviously these women were often property owners, which, for the longest period, and as far as suffrage goes for both men and women, was the defining factor, was if you owned property, right? After slavery was abolished in 1834, Black women and men were not officially excluded as a group, right, in the Canadian franchise, but because of systemic racism, which is apparently a taboo word in Quebec, a lot of Black people just didn't have property, so they couldn't vote anyway. There wasn't a specific restriction on them except property rights in this case. And it's only really with the British North America Act, so that act that created Canada as we know it today, or mostly as a nation state that we know today, that full citizenship and therefore voting rights was legally limited to white men who were property owners and above 21 in this case. And so obviously that's when a lot of laws, provincial and federal, specifically mentioned that, quote, male British subjects aged 21 years or upwards being a householder shall have a vote, right? So they specifically include the term male in this case. And by the end of the century, right, that's when really most of them would specifically exclude, as new provinces would be created in the West and all that. That's where the word of the law really kept going into specifically excluding women, right? I don't know if you had any thoughts about those early days that you wanted to mention, but I just thought it was interesting to at least acknowledge the fact that women used to have rights that were just kind of not, that were actually actively removed. I don't know if you had anything to say about that, or we can just kind of go into the rest of the suffrage movement. Yeah, Camille.
I just want to, now everybody knows I rose my hand. I just wanted to mention quickly that, these kinds of historical I guess I could call them the historical hiccups with feminist movements is not uncommon to see, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But um, in the Middle Ages, women in France, for example, had a lot more access to property rights and had a lot more decisional power within their villages. And so when we think about the way that um, societies are constructed in terms of women's roles in society, there's always a bit of a weird gap where women in the Roman era, for example, had a lot more power than we envision. And then in the Middle Ages, that was kind of similar in rural villages where women could own property and farms and could be leaders of families. Um, Not to say that this was a perfect system, but that this existed. And then something occurred that sort of broke this kind of progression, if I can put this in quotes. And now we're seeing this also in Canada, where women from Kahnawake, for example, were able to vote in 1925, and then the BNA Act appears, and women no longer have the right to vote, and Black people no longer have the right to vote. So just wanted to kind of make a little link here to say that this is not uncommon, historically speaking, within feminist movements, that you have the weird hiccups, or well, not weird, but that you have these hiccups and these gaps.
It's fair to say weird. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Mac. I didn't want to interrupt you.
No problem. Yeah, no, my point is a bit more of a general one as well, just to highlight what Cam is saying, in the fact that, because we often hear today that the timeline of humanity is progression. We have progressively getting so and so, whereas these hiccups prove that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true in the slightest. There is maybe some truth in, like, oh yeah, overall living quality, maybe we live longer, we have access to certain nutrients more, for sure, but at least in the case of human rights, the rights of others, etc., we can see the fact that there has been a bit of a bouncing ball. And so right now, humanity is on a current track upward, but as the past couple of years of politics have shown within the world, that's easily turned around. That's easily set back. Those rights easily removed. Like, it's like we were talking about when we were talking about the First Nations dystopian novel. We're only ever a couple steps away from both greatness and disaster in humanity. So I think it's something to remember whenever people talk about the idea of progress. We make progress, but we also, as Cam pointed out, we've gone back on our progress too. We see it not just with women, but all sorts of minority groups. I mean, just I was thinking about it today. Look at all those, when people are talking about women's rights in the World War II, women went to the factory, women worked, it was great time for women. But then immediately in the 1950s, we reverted to stereotypical woman, housewife, etc. That just goes to show within the last 100 years, we can go backwards still.
Wondering, this might be a silly question. I'm wondering if the actual right to vote in this case gave something tangible to remove, right? It gave, like, and I'm obviously not saying that the right to vote was a bad thing in and of itself. Like, I think we're all clear on that sense. But I'm wondering, like, when Camille was mentioning that previous eras, like the Roman era or the Middle Ages, or Mac, you were working off of that as well, like, that people in power didn't necessarily see that as a threat because most people of the peasantry or the general population wouldn't have had a say necessarily. Whereas the advent of voting gives something tangible and actually gives a voice not just to men, but to women eventually as well. And that's something tangibly removable in this case. And that's maybe why we can see these backwards movements, so to speak, or anti-progressive movements toward that. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud if the actual advent of voting is what allowed these anti-progressive thoughts to emerge, so to speak. I guess naturally they would, but that's just me thinking out loud. Maybe it means nothing.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like it makes sense to say this. I'm obviously not a politician by trade, so I wouldn't be able to specifically say yes or no, but I feel like
Not saying yes or no? You're already a politician then.
Well, what
We
I
got
mean
the
by that is,
political humor too.
but I feel also that part of what comes into context here is the fact that voting gives you the opportunity to create an impact and a change. And so in this sense, you can definitely argue against someone's right to vote, someone's right to make these decisions and to be implicated in the social construction of a city or a country or a nation. And I think, yes, definitely in that sense, of course. But back then in medieval and Roman times, like you said, Patrick, perhaps Roman society is a bit different in that sense, but in medieval society it was an absolute monarchy, so you wouldn't really have decisional power regardless of who you were and where you were, but you had the ability to influence certain ideas about how the world worked. And within a village, at the very least, you needed to have this collaborative
The only way
way
to
of
survive.
thinking. Yeah. So I think it was just more of a common sense thing, whereas in the Roman era, I think there was at least a genuine, if I can say genuine, sense of seeing women as an inherent part of raising the future generations of Romans who could eventually become senators and politicians. And so they had an important space. And this comes back to like earlier histories of how women were perceived as being part of the community, and so had to be a part of the community. So they had to have these decisional powers. But today, because, and I'm saying today, like after the industrial revolution and even earlier, men had completely, and almost to maybe less today, I don't know, but had completely regimented the sectors of power and industry for themselves and actively excluded women from any kind of participation in society except for the rearing of children and the taking care of the household. So it was a very difficult battle in that sense to kind of to demonstrate that women had this capacity to be able to actively participate in the social sphere. And that's why the wars were so important, because it was the right moment for a lot of women to implement the kind of pressures that they needed to implement in order to gain the vote. At least in Canada, anyway. That's my theory about that.
Everywhere as well. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, Mac. I feel like everywhere as well that would have been similar. Like there's a reason why you see the Irish independent movement arise at around that time, where a lot of revolution, like the Russian Revolution, happened in World War One, and all kinds of other women's suffrage movements across the world. So I think that's a fair point in this case with the wars. Sorry, Mac, go ahead.
No, just to add to that, because I also think Cam brought up a good point about just because when you take a look at the discourse around women at this time, as she was saying, they were child rearers. It's commoditization and very like, what do you bring to the workplace more than anything? And I think that's what made the World War so important, is because there was a sudden vacuum, because capitalism needs its workers. That was what makes the world go round. So finally, in that commoditization, in that valuation of a woman as a worker, they were allowed to step away from that worker as child bearer, child rearer, because the supply changed. So in the economics of humanity, which is really depressing when I talk about it, and I don't like it because it just means we're all reduced to our jobs, which is goddamn. But that's part of where it came from, is now there's a necessity, and now women held both. They were the supply, so they can make demands, because before, when they originally allowed to vote, the land ownership way of doing it, they were almost doing it through a loophole. It was a loophole, like, oh, I just so happen to be a woman that owns land, therefore I have power. And then that every time it happened, every man was like shocked Pikachu face. Oh yeah, but they just kept it in because it wasn't something they had to worry about at the time. And then because we didn't have the same demands for a universal right to vote. But as soon as those demands happened, they were very quick to squash it and be like, no, now we're specific. We're going to get rid of the loop, which I think is almost better, because then it makes it so that the suffrage movement is very concrete. Like there is no more, it's not a loophole anymore. It's not just like it is very much an upheld thing.
Absolutely.
But the suffrage movement in itself is kind of like a bit of an illusion, in the sense of like when you're talking about being more concrete, there were still these loopholes that were present, right? You
Right.
had to be a white woman, you had to be middle class, you had to be over a certain age, and
Hmm.
if I'm not mistaken, also at the beginning for women's rights, it was women who were widowed, for example. So, and
Yeah.
were too old to remarry, right? And so you have all of these little aspects that were
True.
not only from the legal perspective of how men try to manipulate the way that the law could be regimented, but also women themselves being of the suffragist or the suffragette movement were also highly regimented in the way that of declaring who had the right to vote. And that was typically white middle class women. So it took a very long time also again for other minorities, female minorities to be actively a part of that movement if they so chose to do so. Because I think also the Black women's movement actively protested against this suffragist movement in Canada, or at least in the US, but I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe I'm mixing my
Yeah.
history up a little bit.
And for sure, when I
I
say
mean,
concrete, I mean concrete as anything can be in government and politics, which is all a flimsy illusion that is collectively upheld by the people,
or those in power.
those in power specifically.
Hmm. Okay. I think this was a really interesting way to like introduce a lot of the key concepts that we're going to be working with in this case throughout the rest of the episode. But just to get into the suffrage movement itself, right? Um, you know, Canadian suffragism, obviously, as we were talking about, came from a particular recognition that women lacked political equality, right? In their ability to express themselves on who was in power or who was able to be voted into power, right? So that's kind of the basic understanding. And Camille and I were talking a little bit about this before we started recording, but the idea that real power rests in the act of being able to actually participate in these things is, I think, one of the foundational recognitions that the suffrage movement was going with, or one of the foundational ideas that the suffrage movement was operating under. And I think that's a strong way to start in this case. And obviously, that limits a lot of other things in this case. But in this case, the at least act of acknowledging that political action and political power is where the real uh, rights lie in this case, on some level, I think is a good way to begin a movement, whether it's with women or other types of civil rights. So I think an important distinction to make in this case with Canada, right, is that we're going to be referring here to suffragists, right, which is a distinction I was not thoroughly aware of before researching this episode. But suffragists are actually distinguished from suffragettes, right? And I think part of that comes from my education here in Quebec, is that we just say in French suffragette, right? It's the same word for all of it, right? So
We
I just
also
never
don't
made
talk
that
about the
distinction.
distinction between the two anyway.
Right, exactly.
I mean, I was raised in an English education system and nobody ever made the difference to me.
Okay, great. So I'm happy to know that it's not just a Quebec thing. So, but in this case, just so people are aware who might not have been, suffragists are generally considered to be supporters of nonviolent tactics, whether it be protesting or other types of movements. Whereas suffragettes were the more militant ones, and these are often associated with Britain's women's social and political movement, or Emily Pankhurst was a major figure in Britain for that particular type of movement. So, setting bombs, breaking windows, like that was a thing that was done in Britain that a lot of people don't necessarily think about.
Nice.
And that
Do
here
it.
in Canada, yes, here in Canada, we were just like, no, I don't think I'll be doing that, eh? I like that window. It's nice.
It keeps the cold out, eh? It makes me think of, this is gonna be a weird tangent, but the character from Mary Poppins, the mother who's a suffragette. She's like, she says she doesn't call herself a suffragist, she calls herself a suffragette. And that was probably a mistake by the Disney like writing crew. But
I
it
was just
makes
about
me
to say
think,
what?
it makes me like, and now I'm headcanoning that the mother from Mary Poppins was throwing bombs around and Mary Poppins helped her do it.
That would make that movie so much more enjoyable to watch, just to know that behind the scenes there's just this pipe bomb throwing.
Sorry, kids, you need the nanny because mommy's at the police right now. I've been arrested. Pipe bomb.
That's the
Wouldn't
sequel
that
that
make
everyone
it
needs.
such a much more interesting episode, film though, to think of like the mother being that kind of activist? Not to say that I condone violence, it's just it would be an
I mean,
interesting way of looking at the story.
when it comes to resistance, I don't think any of us condone violence. We just recognize the fact that violence, as it
But I
turns
mean,
out, like. But again, as we were talking
is
about in
it?
our Portia White episode on Pop Canada, for
Sure.
those who don't know and don't listen to, you should listen to Pop Canada. Resistance is different wherever you go, and it's going to take. Patrick probably.
No, but I think, well, I don't think any of us are like saying like, oh, go out and throw bombs or whatever. I don't want to say that, but I do think any social movement, in the case of the women's here, I think a great part of the strength of the nonviolent ones, what came from the fact of like, well, at least we're not throwing bombs. Do you want us to start throwing bombs? Because other people are doing it, right? And I think
We can throw
you see
bombs if
that a
you
lot.
want, fam. I'll do
But
it.
that's the
I'll
thing
fucking
is that
do it.
you see that also with the civil rights movement. It's like part of the power that, or at least the recognition for people like Martin Luther King, right? And the fact that people listen to him so much is that, hey, at least he wasn't the Black Panthers, right? Or at least he wasn't Malcolm X or something like that, which alienated a lot of people, but also woke them up to the fact that like, hey, there are other people that are clearly willing to take this as far as they are in this case. And if we don't give these women who are protesting peacefully, the rights that they're demanding, it might end up there, and we don't want to necessarily do that. So I think there is some value to the violence insofar as it's it helps the rhetorical and the rhetorical devices of the non-violent ones, right? I don't know if that makes sense in this case. Yeah, okay, cool. Another thing that I think is particularly important, right, is to hit on the fact that we were talking about before, is that a lot of these early movements were very much middle class, right? And I'm not saying that necessarily as a spite, but it does change the perspective that a lot of these women were taking on women's rights, right, and women's movement. And for example, a lot of the issues concerning women's rights centered around property rights, right? The right to own property or the right to be recognized as people, or became an expression of natural justice and maternal values, which were very much linked to middle class. Again, the idea of labor rights would have been more of a lower class or working class type of thing, which is important, but wouldn't have been at the forefront necessarily of a lot of middle class women who were often independently wealthy or who already had secure jobs, right? Especially later when we're going to be talking about the First World War, when a lot of women were co-opted into the workforce, right? And so were able to have some kind of independent wealth, right, from their husband. And that allowed them a certain form of privilege that allowed them to be protesting in the streets, where a lot of middle class women, lower class women did not necessarily have that ability because they had to fucking provide for the family, right? Just as much as anyone else. And they had other things to deal with. And I think that's an important point to make in this case.
Yeah, no,
I don't know.
We can see it again. It's a reflection of today where a lot of protest resistance movies are fizzling out because we don't have them. We don't have the people that can actually like afford, have the time. And upper class people, they're less likely to do it because they are the ones in power, you know, or upper class women aren't going to do it because they know that their current success is hinged usually on their relationship to a more successful. It would put their lifestyle and livelihood, it could put that at risk. So as the middle class shrinks, we probably get less of that. And I'm not going to be the conspiracy nut and say it's on purpose, but I'm also not going to be like, oh, this is just a random happening. This is just something that just happened, whatever. Like, we've known about the shrinking middle class for decades.
Yeah, for sure. It is a recognized fact, but at the same time, your argument does ignore the fact that there are significant working class movements everywhere in the world, like in the third world and or so whatever
Oh,
the
sure.
global south, if you want to talk about it. But like there are still millions of people that participate in these
Oh,
kinds
I'm
of
sure. And we
movements
still had
worldwide.
major movements, but like in relation to what you're talking about, you like
Sure.
you were saying earlier, a lot of these movements
Mhm.
started as middle class movements. And I think that's an
Yeah.
important distinction.
Absolutely. I wonder if also that's part of it. And I don't know if you have anything to say about this, either of you, but there's a sentiment from the working class of like, we have so much to gain in this case in terms of, right to unionize or right to, just basic living and stuff like that, that voting is just so low on the totem pole in this case that you're just trying to survive at this point for a lot of people. And I'm wondering if that's part of the reason why it's not as prevalent as middle class. This is really just a thought. I have no historical foundation for making this claim. It's just a thought I had going into it, and I don't know if you wanted to say anything about it. If not, we could just move on to the next point in this case.
No, but I feel like the working class has a lot to gain from the vote, and I would understand why it would be low on the totem pole, but as you say, but I I think I think that there are a lot of labor movements that encouraged the women's right to vote because it would increase the labor group to be able to participate in the chambers and be able to try to fight for laws and that are fairer for the working class. And I think we shouldn't necessarily dismiss it as like, well, it was not really important for them. I think it was extremely important for them,
I'm not saying
but
it wasn't
perhaps part of
important. It
it,
was more they didn't have the time to focus on it. It's the
yeah,
old
yeah,
argument, when you taught, I can't remember the
Absolutely.
quote right now, but when we talked about shoes, you want to get a good pair of shoes because you can use those for years. You want to get things like the suffrage movement, all that, because those will overall help your conditions. But it's so hard already for you just to scrape by that it's hard to think I'm not saying it's not important for the labor class. I meant more in the middle class. They're in a place where they do not have the same worries. So therefore they have
mhm.
more time, free income, etc. I still think it's incredibly important and we need more like support for working class than everybody else. It's that much harder for them from a perspective of time, money, risk of what can happen to them. If they're in a protest that suddenly turns violent, they get injured, and then because of their healthcare system, if they're living in the States, maybe they're suddenly unable to work and therefore they just die.
Oh yeah, I
Here
mean
at the time.
today I agree with you, but I'm wondering about, in the 20th, 19th, 20th century is I'm sure some of these aspects were still a concern, obviously. But when I think about the Industrial Revolution, for example, where there were huge protests
Mm.
and large gatherings and unionization happened at the time, and that was the labor force. And I think that part of it, and this is purely conjectural, but I feel like part of it also has to do with the fact that the suffragists and suffragettes in US, Canada, and the UK adamantly rejected labor force women and Black women and other minorities because they did not correspond to the goals that these women had, which was exclusively for their class. And I think that that's important to consider as well, and to not simply say that, well, the labor force didn't really have the time to think about it. They had the time. It was harder to organize, but they
Right.
did think about it and they did have
Yes.
the time to think
Okay.
about it. So that's just one of the
Yes.
clarification I
Yeah.
wanted to.
Okay. That makes sense.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely valid.
For sure.
Sorry, I'll let you go, Mac, but it also fits in with like further ideas. What you're saying, Camille, fits in with further ideas, I guess, of what the suffragists jet were doing in Canada. Like a lot of them would associate with religious movements, right? And here in Canada and in Britain, we had what was called the social gospel movement in this case, which is kind of cool insofar as like what it represents. It's better education for most people, focusing on laws and specifically child welfare and poverty in this case. And I think what we're talking about in this case is it's any interest that they had in the middle class in this case, or in the working class, would have been very paternalistic or maternalistic, to use that word, I guess, insofar as they were concerned with the children of the poor and with the moral sentiments of the poor. So that's where you have like temperance movements come in, right? And you were talking, Kimmy, about that earlier, about the morality element as well. Very important to keep in mind, right? So there is some overlap, right? I guess that you can acknowledge of the lower and middle class, but it's very tenuous, and it's often from one relation to another is like a bit hierarchical, well, very hierarchical in a sense, and one that kind of recognizes the other as, you need our help, honey, right? And it's very icky to think about it that way. Yeah, I don't know, Mac. I didn't want to interrupt you before. Did you have anything that you wanted to add about
I
that?
think I've already okay, because I just wanted to. I think okay, so I think my argument was coming from the point of misunderstanding. So we were but the just like for my own clarity, because I'm a dum dum, the suffragettes and suffragists were actively not going to the labor workers and the women of the working class for help, or
Yes and no. Like some of them would have, there would have been some overlap in this case, and they would have recognized, we've talked about this before with like when we were talking about the effect of industrialization in Canada, of like there would have been some recognition that the poor or the working class needed better better laws, better protection, better conditions in general. But the actual overlap would not have been significant. And a lot of the working class would have had their own movements, right? And the middle class would have had their own movements. And any kind of overlap would have
they
been
weren't working
like
together.
Right, exactly. Would have been relatively limited, at least at first. Later, I think it did, later in the 20th century or in the start of the 20th century, I think it did get better, but at least at first it was relatively separate, right?
It's one of the greater, I'm coming back to this word again, but one of the greater illusions of the feminist movement at its start is that there was this concept of everybody was unified. They were speaking for all women, but the Black feminist movement in particular at its beginning were some of the first to actually contest this idea for obvious reasons, to say that you're not speaking for every woman, and to say that you're speaking for women and not for women here declares this universality of what a woman is, whereas as a Black woman there is this intersectionality of feminism and Blackness, and that was much more complicated. If I'm to euphemize it, it was much more complicated. And so a lot of these feminist movements, especially at its start, not only were middle class, but were also very exclusive and exclusionary of who was part of the group. And so woman had a very specific definition that was hidden under the gaze and under the guise of universalism.
And honestly, it hasn't changed from what I see. Like it's definitely, it has changed in some ways, but I still see many instances where it doesn't feel, as a man looking outside, like I can be totally talking on my ass. Tell me, that's fine. But from what I've seen in observations, there's still problems in that where white women will not acknowledge the different issues and the different like problems that exist for women of minorities, etc. I mean, even if we take a look at a more modern context of women looking at trans women, we see some problems there. And I know we've talked about that before, Cam, and there's a whole conversation to be had there, but it doesn't always seem like there's the right.
No, for sure. And it's not to minimize that this is an issue within the feminism, but I think it's also important to recognize that when you think about social movements, that tends to happen almost every single time. I can't think right now of a movement that was all inclusive all the time. And I think there are important necessities behind doing this to be slightly exclusionary, in the sense that you can't necessarily, like, if you think about writing a book, right? Because we will be looking at literary works here. When you think about writing a book or an essay about a specific issue, you can't necessarily include everybody, because universalizing to that extent erases personal experience and erases specific experiences within a specific group. So there are some advantages of being exclusionary, but I think also we need to recognize the fact that a lot of the times it's not exclusionary for those purposes. It's exclusionary because there's this sense that that this group's experience is more important than the others. And that might not be true for everyone. And this is a very general statement here. But I think it's also important to just recognize that there are some importance, that there is an importance in being exclusionary as well as being inclusionary completely, but it does present some difficulties in terms of articulating an argument that is in favor. But I still remain on the point that it's important to recognize that there are other experiences happening out there that go beyond what you're experiencing, that yes can be worse, but just a quick thing, in narrative medicine we talk about the lack of relevance that has to say that my experience is worse than yours, that we have to look at it from a different perspective. And I think that in feminism this is something that needs to be done as well, and this is where intersectionality actually comes in terms of being able to establish a bit more of a union or a unified front, if not to completely say that we are all the same, but that our experiences have some kind of link with each other, just to the fact that we're all at least identify as women. Yeah.
And I don't know, because I feel like the term exclusion has a bit of a negative connotation to it. I get what you're going for in this case. Would it be fair to say better defined in this case, or more
focused,
defined?
maybe?
More focused is perhaps a better term. I don't know if exclusion.
Because that's what I think the benefit of having an exclusion is, more just that you are very focused on a specific issue, and I find that can often be more successful. Is like, I will focus on this one problem that I know I can solve right now. I will focus on X there, and then it gives you more, like, it gives you goals. You can set up a process, a plan, and that is often more appealing to people to do. You know, for example, I have the goal right now to get chemicals out of the water. Here's the process, and that's not going to fix the environment. It's not going to fix the problems in the city, but it is a very like specific driven goal. I think that's more, it excludes other problems for sure that you're not talking about, but you can very much drive it that way. You very much can be like, oh, I'm going to do this, and we can get this done. And that's what people often look for, is they want to see the path to get results. It's why we have such a problem thinking in the long term and with big issues, because we can't focus.
I feel like this comes down to a semantics of language. I mean, you know, at this point, the way I see it, and this is perhaps, I am maybe the only person who thinks that way. I doubt it. But when I think about more focused, or what was it, Patrick, that you said? It was not more focused, but
clearly delineated or something. Yeah.
Yeah, or like, yeah, to be clearly defined, you know, according to whom here, what is clearly defined, and why is more focusing on this more important? And I think here the word exclusionary might have this very negative connotation today, but a lot of discourse, older discourse, sorry, but tends to use the term as purely as what it's being said. I am excluding this group at the moment because this has its own set of parameters that I can't talk about in this book. It's not to say you're not included in the conversation. It's just you're not included in this conversation right now. And again, that's problematic. But I think at this point, you know, another way that we can look at it is, are we purposefully being myopic about certain issues when we write a certain essay or book, or when we try to set a movement? And is there a reason for this myopia? But again, I feel like it's very semantics here.
For sure,
anyway,
for sure.
Maybe some of the listeners here can help us out and say, well, I think this word is better. Maybe that'll start a whole debate.
No, but I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's important also to recognize, like, and this is an earlier point that was made, is that there are certain times when women did, in this particular context, and again, this was more in the 20th century, but did get together beyond class differences. But it was often outside of an explicitly feminist group, right? So you saw it in like temperance circles, right? We brought that up earlier, or Christian circles, which is often an overlap, or later in the 20th century, like socialist circles, for example, would have, a whole grab bag of people from different areas that would get together under that other common umbrella in this case. But there was still some kind of exclusion, I guess, that was happening in what you're talking about. So I do think you're right with the semantic point, but I do think it's an important semantic point nonetheless to kind of discuss and flesh out. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Sorry, Mark, did you have anything to say? And then we'll kind of move on. Yeah.
I agree with both of you. Like, it is a semantic argument that is kind of dumb, but I agree with both of you, says the politician.
Okay. Wonderful. Excellent politician.
Well, hang on. I just want to make sure here that people understand me. I'm not saying that the semantics issue is stupid. I just mean that it's thinking about the language that we're using here and avoiding the word exclusion because it's negative, I think is as equally problematic as saying that you're being exclusionary for certain purposes. And yeah, I don't think it's stupid to either change the word exclusion or to keep it. It's just that I think that it's also something that we do need to think about. And so in that sense, yes, Patrick, I agree with that. And that was the point I was trying to make. I'm sorry if I was unclear on that.
No, it's fine. That's why we're discussing.
What did
That's
you
why the
say?
podcast lasts that's why the podcast lasts 2 hours, is because we're always unclear. Like, we always have to specify ourselves. But okay, so getting back to the topic at hand in this case, and I do appreciate these tangents that we're having in this case. I do think they're quite nice.
I love to learn about these things because I know I have a lot that I.
Yeah, and so just to think of a few groups in this case, and it's always hard to. I don't like to specify specific people necessarily that were important, just because I feel like it removes from the fact that this was a group effort, generally speaking. But there are some notable people or groups to mention that I think helped and were important in the shift towards better equality for women in Canada during the 19th and early 20th century. And, there was one group in particular, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was founded in 1874 by Letitia Eumetz, I assume is how you pronounce her name. And it eventually became a national organization in 1883. And again, by 1891, it officially endorsed female suffrage. So I do think it's interesting to consider, and we kind of talked about this already, so we don't need to delve, I think, too deeply into it, but to kind of consider the way in which these temperance movements, or these movements based on morality, did evolve towards suffrage movements in a sense, right? In many cases. And it was in 1883 that we saw the first emergence of a group that was specifically dedicated to women's suffrage causes. And that would have been the Canadian Women's Suffrage Association, the CWSA, which was formed in 1883. And it had started off as a literary club, which I think is of particular interest for us here as literary students and as English majors, right? That it started off as the Toronto Women's Literary Club in 1876 by Dr. Emily Howard Stowe, who's a prominent feminist and suffragist from the time. And that eventually became the Suffrage Association. In 1881, Sarah Curzon of the Literary Club became the associate editor of the Canadian Citizen, which was a temperance newspaper that also endorsed the vote in this case. Yeah.
I just have a question, because it is interesting that it started as the Toronto Women's Literary Club, but I wonder, I don't know if this is purely conspiratorial, but wasn't it kind of a thing that minority groups would do? They would create like a club, quote unquote, that would actually have a different agenda. So it wasn't exactly, was it like that? It wasn't a literary club, but it was actually a feminist club, but they hid under that title, or was it really just a literary club?
I was going to say something similar, because I can't think of the examples off the top of my head, but I know there have been a lot of movements that start under the guise of something else, or they start with the intention of being a book club, but then it just so happens that due to the time that they are living in, they're talking about thing X and they become thing X instead. I think it is a particular note, but it's also like a very common thing that happens with movements. They will start out as a religious gathering, maybe, and then through the course of talking about modern events, they become such and such, you know?
So for the Toronto Literary Club in particular, it did start off with rather radical ambitions, at least for the time, insofar as, dun dun dun, it advocated for the education of women. Radical, I know. Yeah, women were allowed to have just as, you know, we're supposed to be just as smart as men, and that was the Toronto Literary Club's goal in this case. I'm making a joke about this; it's a bit tongue in cheek, but you know, many aspects of it were quite, radical for the time. Emily Stowe, for those of you who might not know, was the first woman physician to practice medicine in Canada, by the way. So as far as like medical humanities and feminism goes, that's like pretty important. And basically the TWLC was a weekly meeting space and community for educated women. So it was, again, exclusionary of working class for the most part, who couldn't read or write. And it was started to, after Stowe was inspired by the American Association for the Advancement of Women, right, which was a kind of conference in this case. So the radical idea of the literary club was there from the start. It just wasn't necessarily associated with suffrage, right? Or it might have been. I'm sure a lot of the people that were there might have been suffragists, even if it wasn't official. But at least the how can I say, the dedication to women's causes was there from the start, right? Even if it did have the literary aspect to it or angle to it. Yeah, Camille.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, just because I'm going to keep slipping Kirsten de Pizan here until I actually talk about her. But one of the things that Kirsten de Pizan, who was a medieval writer in France, spoke about, and these were some of the first appearances of feminism, because feminism was coined in like the 1700s, but just a start of the mentality of women having more of a space in society. One of the first things that was being advocated for was women's education from the get-go. And Kirsten de Pizan was a huge proponent of that. And she actually talks about this in her book, which I'll get to a little bit later. But yeah, I just wanted to make that little mention that that this was not a new idea, but the fact that it was still prevalent at that time speaks volumes in terms of what we were speaking of at the beginning of having these gaps in history. And so here to perhaps not think about the feminist movement or any kind of social movement actually as in terms of progress, but in terms of process, because you are going to have these dips. But again, this is another question of semantics.
No, for sure. And I think it's an important point to make in this case. And I love the kind of incessant foreshadowing of Kirsten de Pizan in this case. But yeah, and you know, we're just talking about a few aspects here, but I do think it is important to highlight the successes of this movement that were actually there relatively early on as far as suffrage goes. So in the 1870s and 1880s, a lot of provinces would give the right to women, the right to vote for women at a municipal level, right? So a suffrage bill was introduced in British Columbia in 1872, where propertied women received the municipal franchise, and that came into effect in 1873. So while the BNA Act did mention that men specifically had to were the only ones that could vote, it would kind of be on a municipal level. That would be kind of interesting to see that in British Columbia. And this comes back to something that Camille mentioned earlier. In Ontario specifically in 1882, spinsters and widows won the municipal right to vote. So it's interesting to kind of think about that it's only women who were not necessarily associated with men that could vote in this case. And I don't know if there's anything to that. I don't know the logic behind this particular bill, right, in Ontario, but you know, it's good to note, I guess, that unmarried and or widows were, you know, allowed to vote. That's cool. In 1886 and 1887 and 1888, we had municipal rights to vote for women in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, respectively. So there are definitively movements and moments, or headwaters, I guess, that are worthy of note in this case. And dear old friend of the show, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, would come
Johnny
out as
McD.
McD.
Make some noise.
I don't remember if we talked about I don't remember if we had talked about this when we did our episodes on him, but did we talk about his support of women's suffrage in Canada? I don't
There were
remember.
so many other things we were talking about, referencing your good old Johnny McD. Johnny McD's nuts.
The worst joke possible, but okay.
Yo, Johnny Boy would love that joke. Don't even at me.
He would. That's true. But yeah, and the 1885 Franchise Act was kind of a big deal. It reformed who could vote in Canada, and namely those people who were propertied or not. But he would come out as a supporter of women's right to vote in that act, and it didn't go through the way that it would, because women's federal right to vote would not be achieved until the First World War. But it's still notable that the Prime Minister was in favor of this. And it just didn't go through in the House of Commons for a variety of reasons, notably because it was a bunch of grumpy old men who didn't think that women could have the right to vote. So, not surprising there. And it's always kind of debated as to Macdonald himself, whether or not he truly believed that women should have the right to vote, or if it was like a political move on his end, because politicians be politicians. But I do think it's still,
could have been both.
Whether it's a cynical move or not, I think it's an important thing to mention that, hey,
another facet of the complicated statue that is Johnny A. McDonald.
D100, that is Johnny McD.
Johnny McD's nuts. Ah, made it again.
So it also happens
just
that
shaking
around...
her head. For those who don't know, she's shaking her head at me. That's fine. When it comes to Johnny A, we always
deserve it.
We always have a good laugh with him.
Yeah,
it's what he would want.
While we're talking about all these advances that women had as far as suffrage goes in the 1880s, it is important to note that a lot of people, women or not, had their rights to vote removed in this time as well. So this is where a lot of Asian Canadian communities, for example, would have their rights formally stripped, right? And of course, as we were talking about, African Americans, while not necessarily being denied the right to vote, did have a bunch of systemic and societal limitations to that ability as well, right? So it is noteworthy that there's a very significant tug and pull that's going on socially here that is not all sunshine and roses, because Japanese and Chinese Canadians, for example, just would not be able to vote until much later in Canada's history, for example, whether they're women or men. And yeah, that's obviously unfortunate. Yeah. So in 1889, the CWSA, who we mentioned earlier, was renamed the Dominion Women's Enfranchisement Association. And this is where they would kick off an active campaign that included visits from leading American suffragists like Anna Shaw, Susan B. Anthony, and so on, and kind of does demonstrate what we were talking about earlier, insofar as there is a kind of, I don't want to use the term base building, but there's a kind of connection that's happening across borders, right? Where, yes, we're talking about a Canadian perspective here, but I think it's unfair to say that whatever we're talking about here is a purely Canadian thing, right? A lot of the things that we're referring to did obviously have an impact worldwide, or at least at this time throughout many parts of the world, and is definitely interesting to consider of like how American and British people were also part of this movement in Canada, and vice versa. And this is something that I remember that I read in the Cleverdon book, is that that's something that a lot of suffragists in the 20th century would mention to the Prime Minister at the time, Bennett, No, sorry, not bed, boredom. It was being like,
One of the
hey,
4 clowns. One of our 4 beloved clowns.
One of those people that starts with a B, whatever. And the idea being that one of the arguments is like, hey, you love the British so much, and yet they have the vote and we don't. What's that all about? And that was kind of like one of the pressure tactics that was used, of saying like, hey, the mother countries, quote unquote, have the right to vote, and there's all this rhetoric that Canada's better somehow. So like, where's our right to vote, asshole? So kind of cool to mention that as a pressure point. Yeah. But yeah, what I think is important to note as well, and I'll be pulling explicitly from Cleverdon in this case, is something that she brings up. I just have the book here that I pulled up, and I didn't really put it in the notes because this came up at the last minute, is that one of the major things that suffragists faced, right? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this, or one of the major issues that suffragists faced is that, and I'll just read from Cleverdon here in this case. In fairness to Canadian men, however, it should be stated at the outset that the task of the women advocates of political equality was made doubly onerous by the apathy, if not outright hostility, which they encountered quite widely among members of their own sex. Suffrage forces constituted but a small minority of Canadian women throughout the entire campaign, except possibly on the prairies, and drew their most active recruits in general from the small segment of the feminine population which had a fair degree of economic independence. Outstanding suffragists were most frequently professional and self-employed women or wives of men with comfortable incomes. So the latter part, I think, is something that we've talked about before, but I do think that the point on apathy and downright hostility by a lot of women is an interesting point to bring up. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that as to like how that would emerge or why that would emerge, because I think it's something that we don't necessarily consider like in the grand scheme of Canadian history. We often try to think of like, yeah, everyone agreed with this, at least as far as women were concerned. So like, because it's to their benefit. So like, why not? But yeah, I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to add about this or say to that effect.
I mean, it's difficult to be in these women's heads, whether they were actually very apathetic about it or not. But I think I think part of it also is if you look at the beginning of that quote, um, I'm sensing somewhat of a dual tactic here. The first having to do with the apathy of other women, to perhaps just illustrate the fact that this sort of adamant rejection from other women could possibly stem from the fear of loss of economic status by these women, which I don't think is too much of a stretch to make. So I think there was part of that. But to use such strong language, I think comes back to the initial comment that she made about men, which I think her name is Klung, mentioned in your notes. Yeah, McClung, who also kind of states this kind of general idea that almost excludes, not excludes, but excuses men's behaviors as either a conscious belief that, or this conscious belief that men were not trying to be assholes, excuse the language here, but
Say
perhaps
whatever the
maybe
fuck
also
you
to,
want.
or
Boys will
to,
be boys. It's fine.
no, yeah, sure, sure. Um, or simply the fact that there was a bit of a tactic here to be somewhat patronizing towards men as well, and this was a bit of a hidden language scheme. And McClung does this as well. We can talk about that later, but I think that perhaps has to be considered as well, is to say, well, men weren't all that bad, when you consider how women were behaving. And I think it's simultaneously true that there were some women who were probably extremely against these new ideas because it's advocating for a change. And as we can already see, even corporate worlds, that change is extremely difficult to adapt to. And when it's being spoken by a small group of people, but that this small group says that it's speaking for all women, it's excluding a lot of voices here, and that's perhaps why you have this language that's being used, that there are some women who are apathetic towards this. But I think that simultaneously also it's kind of trying ironically put men in a good light, but maybe that's an over reading of that section. I don't know. Was she ironic in the rest of her book?
I read the book many years ago at this point in its entirety, so I can't say. But I wouldn't be like, I could see that being the case. I also know that part of the debates at the time, which I think gives credence to Cleverdon's point in this case, part of the point at the time, or what part of the discourse, I should say, at the time was that where does it end, right? And we'll get into this with McClung specifically later, but the idea of having other people that were not part of the very specific social circle that a lot of suffragists were a part of have the right to vote was also scary for a lot of people, right? And I think your point of saying that, like, well, if we have the right to vote, then we'll have the same responsibilities as men, maybe, or something like that, and it'll remove from our how could I say this in a sense, like the specific tasks that we as women have and that we hold to, right, as mothers, as housekeepers, as whatever, right, which I can understand the importance of when for generations you had been doing that, right? But yeah, the idea of where does it end was a sphere for some people, and that's where immigrants or lower classes or like working classes would have entered into the discussion of being like, well, we can't give these people, right, the right to vote as well, so we have to find a way to limit it. And for some people that limit was just not having it, right? It was just like, well, might as well just make it a non-starter. I don't know how widespread that was. I can't remember any statistics of like how widespread that actual thought was, but I do see her point, and I do think you make a good point, although I don't know enough about Cleverdon's personal views to say that, like, yeah, she just wanted to forgive men because they're not all bad. Which could
But I
definitely
mean,
be
you're starting to see a bit of a resurgence in terms of the sentiment that Cleverdon brings, in modern day North America in general, that a lot of women are actually starting to advocate for being stay-at-home moms, which I have nothing against. But it's interesting to see how there are so many women right now who are posting videos of themselves being a staying-at-home mom, and how they're justifying that the fact that they're being stay-at-home moms is doing their part for society. And I, again, do what you want with your life. That's fine. I have nothing against it. I really don't. But I just thought it was an interesting point to make here, that, thinking about the fact that there were some women who were fearful about this kind of independence, right? And have kind of been, or were sort of erased. I don't want to say eradicated, but more erased from the history and erased from the discourse, are now coming back in our time, and trying to reestablish the place of, I mean, women in the home is a bit of a loaded statement here, but to just restate the importance of women who are stay-at-home moms, and who want to do this with themselves, with their lives, and that's not something to be ashamed of, which I completely agree with. But I think anyway.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, just because because that's how the system is designed. Like, our system is designed in such a way that there is supposed to be one person at home taking care of the home, the homestead, the kids, or whatever, and the other person works. And that is how, like, life goes on within our current system. I think the problem, and people want to do that, go ahead. I think there's the worry that I see or whatever, that it's gonna be disproportionate. It should be the stay-at-home parent, not the stay-at-home mom. I think is the worry, that's what at least what I'm trying to. I think I'm picking up on what you're saying. I don't know. I could be wrong, but just the idea is, like, it's very disproportionate. It always has to be the stay-at-home mom, which is almost the worry, the danger, and then there's because then the pressure returns to that role. the pressure returns. Oh, like somebody, you have to stay at home. The mom is the role that stays at home. That's the culturally accepted thing. When it's fine for anybody to be the stay-at-home parent. Like, it's an important job. It is an incredibly important role to have. We just have to make sure it's not a role that then gets gendered.
Absolutely. And it's sort of we're coming into this very slippery terrain where you have a discourse of advocacy for, women and men also who are stay-at-home dads or just, stay-at-home parents. But like you mentioned, Mac, that it's predominantly women who make this decision to stay at home, and they advocate that this was a choice. And I think that that's important to focus on. But you also still have um, other family units who still believes that women are the ones who are supposed to stay at home. So it's a very gray area, I guess is a term that I could use here, where you have women on the one hand who make the choice, so who advocate and who have this agency into choosing their vocation and choosing what they want to do with their lives. But you simultaneously have discourse, and I'm thinking about the US here, but in Canada as well, where politicians are advocating for women to stay at home and actively encourage women to stay at home and to come back and to congratulate the women who make these choices to stay at home and become
Cultural pressures, propaganda,
mothers.
like I'm sure, like, I'm not trying to say your choice is not actually your choice, like the people who are choosing to go back home. I'm just trying to wonder how much of any choice of ours, and like, to rail against technology and modern society and everything for a little bit, how much of any of our choices actually are in that sort
That
of
sounds a
sense.
bit like a conspiracy theory, Mac.
Yeah, it's not like we're getting pressured through social media to behave certain ways. It's not like the government, it's not like big oil is paying people to take pictures with their gas stoves and post them on social media talking about just how great the gas stove is. That definitely didn't happen. Astroturfing? What? I don't know.
I love gas. Anyway,
I love my gas stove.
this episode is brought to you by Big Gas.
Yeah. And again, like, completely different example, but it's just, I just want to highlight that there are these, like, for any situation, any decision that we make, there are these other pressures, and I'm just worried about how those pressures are being pushed onto people and how much of a decision is truly their decision. Because again, I understand the value of having a stay-at-home parent, and that was what my mother did, and she taught me so much. But I would hate for it to be a case where and I know this isn't, like, I know she and my father made a very conscious decision about it, but I just hate for it to be like one of those things like, oh, she has to be the mom. It has to be the woman that returns to the home, when it could be either. It like, depending on any kind of factor.
Well, I mean, this is a very small tangent, Patrick, and then we can move on to something else. But I feel like a lot of the way that social movements concerning women are being put forward is within that kind of odd in between place of choice and enforced decisions. And one of the topics that comes to mind, which I talked about a while ago, not in this episode obviously, but just in terms of research, is prostitution and sex migration, where you know you have to consider the fact that there are some women who make this choice to go to Amsterdam, for example, to become sex workers. There are women here in Canada who make the decision to be sex workers for a time, whether it's to pay for studies, whether because they genuinely enjoy it. I know, controversial idea, but like, these are women
Wait,
who
sex can be
obviously
enjoyable
exist.
for women? No way.
I know.
False.
Wait,
Um,
Candy is actually working her way through college? Excuse me?
Yo, no, but it's like
Look,
that
I
OnlyFans,
know.
the girl on OnlyFans who, like, she was paying her way through Harvard for her law degree, but then they found
Yeah.
her OnlyFans and
yeah,
they tried to kick her out. And
absolutely.
it's like, excuse me, don't have such a fucking
Absolutely.
expensive degree then.
But you have like these events, and prostitution is one of, if not the oldest profession. I know a lot of people have said that. I think it's probably one of the oldest professions that exist. And you have like these weird in between places where some women make the choice to do this, some women are forced to do it, and obviously, women who are forced to do sex work or to prostitute themselves is not okay. But there are also these choices that are non-choices. So women who make the decision to be sex workers in a different country because it's the only way that they can pay for their family's food, housing, and survival. And so you think about, you know, the stay-at-home mom or women who are apathetic about this, who kind of stay perhaps in that zone of non-choice where they're extremely fearful because they don't think that they have the skills to do anything else. And so they make the decision, consciously or not, to fight for that position, to stay within that strata of society, which is to be submissive and oppressed. So that's one outlook. I'm not saying that's the only thing or the only possible argument here. Not at all, because again, I want to reiterate that some women actually do make these choices of being stay-at-home parents, and that their choices are very valid. But I think that this is something that needs to be considered as well when we think about feminist movements and why some women were apathetic and why they were very reticent and apprehensive about what was happening and the changes that were being fought for by these groups like the DWEA or the CWSA.
Absolutely. And again, I don't want to like discount this discussion in this case, but just to go to different points in this case, because we've already been recording for like,
because this is a long episode.
it's fine. And like people listen regardless. It's fine. Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to transition briefly into, or actually quite directly into the literature, right? And I put down a bunch of texts and people, and I don't think we're going to cover all of them just for the sake of time in this case, and just seeing how the conversation is actually unfolding. I think we can probably just concentrate on the Nellie McClung one in this case. But I do still want to at least go over some texts that I think are important at the time, or at least noteworthy for the time, in order to demonstrate just the emergence of these types of themes that we're talking about right now in the literature of Canada, right? So one of the ones that I want to mention is Agnes Mala. I don't know how to pronounce her name. Machar, Machar, who came out with a novel called Roland Graeme Knight in 1892, which that title sucks. I don't like that. There's something about it. It just doesn't roll off the tongue. But it's interesting an interesting novel to think about, and you can find it for free. It's in the public domain at this point. I'm sure you can find it on like archive.org or something like that. But it's a cool novel to consider, not because it pertains particularly to today's standards, but it was one of the first Canadian novels to address directly the need for labor reform. And what Machar does is actively involve Christian activism, temperance movement, and of course, women's roles in these reforms, right? Which at the time would have really been quite a thing to do for both a women writer and just a writer in general. And specifically, she refers to in her novel as she refers to middle class women, right? And who do this through the social gospel and temperance movements. But I think it's still emblematic of a lot of the ideas that we're talking about today that were important or central to the women's movement at the time. And because, Camille, you were mentioning Christine de Pizza and these medieval writers, I did see an article specifically about how Agnes Mala Machar uses medieval ideas in this particular novel, so it might actually be interesting to consider from that perspective. If I don't remember if the actual, how much the actual novel does that, but yeah, it is something to consider in this case. That's kind of cool. The other one I wanted to mention was from French Canada, in this case, Marie-Louise Félicité Anger. I don't miss the days when people had three names. That's a good time gone by in this case. And specifically, she's recognized as one of the first female novelists, if not the first female novelist in French Canada, and also one of the first psychological novelists, right, who published Angeline de Montbrun in 1882. And I don't know if anyone had anything to say about that emergence in particular, but I think it's rather interesting, and we can maybe bring this back to some of the things that McClung talks about of the psychology of women in this case, or exploring, or how women explore psychology and the depths of, thought in their work. And again, you might be able to find, I might link it in the show notes, but Angers' work was often published under a pseudonym, so you probably won't find it under her actual name. I think she wrote under La something. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll link it in the show notes. But yeah, if people want to read that, if they can read French, great, they can check it out. It's an interesting novel to consider for its historical purposes on its own. But yeah, the two in particular that I wanted to talk about, one for the imagery and the other just because it's an interesting essay that encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about. Have either of you had a chance to read the poem Malcolm's Katie by Isabella Valency Crawford before we actually got to the episode? Okay, I see the looks on your face.
I read part of it, Patrick. I have to
It's long.
squint through most poetry anyway. You know this. I do not. I read the beginning. I was reading the opening lines, and then I would go skimming through other parts to get a sense of language and etc. But this whole poem is also fairly long.
Yeah, that's why I put certain passages in the notes and be like, we could just talk about this. But I just want to mention this one. Like, Crawford herself was a well-known journalist and writer of her time, and the actual plot of Malcolm's Katie is very straightforward. Girl meets boy, the father doesn't approve. There's a villain named Alfred, because that's the perfect villain name, is Alfred. And he, there's misunderstandings that are misunderstood, and adventures are adventured, and so on. And
he was a scared boy. She said, "See you later, boy." He wasn't good enough for her.
Katie has her life saved a couple of times, and basically everything ends well for everyone except Alfred, even though he's forgiven at the end, but he doesn't get the woman of his dreams, so fuck Alfred, I guess. But there's a few feminist elements to note in the poem. If anyone has the fortitude, I guess would be the right word, to get through the entire poem in this case. For example, this I think is the perfect one. In book 3, line 576 in total, Katie almost gets killed by a log that is inscribed with her father's initials, and I feel like Freud would have a field day with that one, because that is some what's the term for that is some imagery. I'm blanking on the word right now, but whatever. For penis. Jesus. No, phallic, thank you.
Remember,
Zach, I love that we said that
stuff.
exactly at the same time.
Our minds are on similar wavelengths. It's fine.
Yeah, but I just wanted to admit, like, this is one example of the phallic imagery that emerges and also exists in other Crawford poems. The Canoe has been described by one of my Ken Lit professors as the sexiest poem ever written in Canada. And you can imagine what Crawford does with the image of the canoe itself. So quite racy in that sense. But yeah, and what's kind of interesting as well is that, contrary to what we've been discussing, Crawford herself would not have been a member of the middle class, and I think that does shine through in this particular poem. Where, for example, the heroine's father is fairly bourgeois, but the lover, Katie's lover, Max, is a simple backwoods boy, right? Who's seeking to carve out a simple homestead for him and his bride-to-be, right? And that whole dynamic is very much at play in the entire poem. And I feel like it's interesting to bring up as an alternative to the very middle class perspective that a lot of feminists would have had at the time. And to add to this, right, Alfred himself is described as very wealthy throughout the poem.
The guy named Alfred is well-to-do.
Who'd have thunk?
Who'd have thunk it? This is all just part of the Pennyworth backstory.
I think honestly,
Alfred
if your parents give you the name
Batman's
Alfred,
butler.
but yeah, basically the whole thing to add on to the property ownership, and then we'll move on, I think, to the McClung article in this case, because I know neither of you have read this. But the idea that the poet gives a rather utopian view of owning your own patch of land and being able to work it, and kind of using that as a jumping off point away from the shackles of being working class in the industrial age, I think has a lot of parallels to what we're talking about in this case, of, you know, the rights afforded to property owners would have been much better at the time than what most other people would have been able to accomplish. Okay, I'll stop just speaking without back and forth in this case, but getting into the final piece of literature in this case, Nellie McClung, famous figure, I think, in the feminist Canadian movement. Had either of you heard of her before today?
I heard her name, but I never did much research in it.
Okay. So just a bit of background on her. Like, McClung is very much known as far as like prairie literature and prairie activism is concerned, right? She moved to Winnipeg at a very young age, even though she was born in Ontario. And she would eventually become one of what was called the Famous Five, right? Who are a kind of group of five feminists in this case, who were very active throughout.
Oh yeah, you're again, a feminist in Canada? Name the Famous Five. Go.
Hold on. Google's gonna help me in this case. Yeah, Emily Murphy, Henrietta Weir Edwards, Louise McKinney, and Irene Parlby. There you go. They're the Famous Five with Nellie McClung. But they would become, we can do a whole episode on this, but they would become very famous because they would be at the forefront of what was called the Persons case in Canada, which in the late 20s basically was a case that determined that, surprise, surprise, women were considered people too in the eyes of the law, and not just like wards of the state or of their husbands. What a shocker, right? Yeah, that's where she's coming from, basically. And I brought out an article in this case that was written in 1916 called Speaking of Women. And I'm curious what y'all think of this particular article. I know, Camille, you took notes, but yeah, I don't know, initial thoughts on this particular piece, right?
I mean,
go ahead, Cam.
Okay. I think the language was very interesting. And Pat, actually, we were talking about this earlier this morning on how she was a proponent of eugenics, so it makes a little bit more sense why she would use words like old black fear. And one specific passage that I thought was interesting is where she says, one would think, reading the vaporings which pass as articles on the suffrage question, that good, reliable husbands will be supplied upon request. And the quote continues, but the term vaporings here was kind of interesting, especially related to Black fear and the Black Death, and then here to vaporings, coming back to humoral theory on the vapors, and that speaks back to the psychology of women and how this was in 1916, I think, that she released this article, where this was, in the midst of the First World War, where psychology was being actively developed, specifically for men, because they were coming back from the war with what was then known as either male hysteria or synesthesia. But for women specifically, it was interesting how the psychology and medical understandings were kind of shifting in between humoral theory and biomedical theory. And that's where you would have like hysterics, for example, that would come up as being simultaneously a psychological disorder, but also the wandering womb, this idea of the wandering womb and the animal moving around. So I thought that this was kind of interesting, the way that she talks about men in that sense, and also about how they would be haunted by the ghosts of that old fear that there may not be enough of some things to go around. and things like that. So I thought that the article was interesting in that sense, in terms of the imagery that she was creating, in terms of like actively, I felt applying a certain sense of male hysterics to the men and their way of looking at these political changes that were occurring. But one thing that kind of struck me was something that relates back to Christine de Pizan. Here she is. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, really quickly, Christine de Pizan was a member of the court in France, originally born in Italy. And she actually had a lot of influence in the court, mainly through her writings. She was one of the first women who was able to publish her writings and to be celebrated for it. And one of her very famous work, which is actually one of the only surviving works, was called, or is called, if I can find it again, the Book of the City of Ladies, which was published in 1405, talks about the education of women, and among other things. But she mentions in her book that all this comes down to their lack of education, so women's in this case. So don't forget what I said before, that some men and women being more naturally endowed with intelligence than others. So again, this sort of apologetic rhetoric that we see here of saying that some men are more intelligent than women, but also some women are also more intelligent than men. It really depends. Like, not everybody's created equal in that sense. And then you have McClung here, who mentions something kind of similar in terms of the way that we perceive intelligence and education, by stating that even if the average woman is not always sure of the binomial theorem, that does not prove that she is incapable of saying who shall make the laws under which she shall live. Right? So coming back to this idea again, which is very old, of women's capacity to be active participants in social discourse. Again, both of these women were white. Both of these women were high or middle class. I think McClung was middle class. Yeah. So it again speaks to the education of higher born women, but I think it's interesting that we're coming back to this notion of the way to start this is to educate women into how they're supposed to be active participants. And from that point on, this is where we gain agency. And this is why it's important that women should have the right to vote, because with that they take active interest, and they would change policies much more effectively than you would think is possible. So I think those were kind of my ideas about the text itself, that the language was really fascinating, very medicalized, but also kind of very patronizing in terms of the way that the arguments were created by men towards the women's suffragist movement as well. And something that Pizan did as well, as she would often mention that men's arguments against women and why they think they have the right to mistreat us is stupid, basically. That's not how she put it, obviously, but McClung does something similar. And I think that this is something that a lot of women do in their own rhetoric and their own discourse when they're writing on feminist issues, whether it's in McClung's time, Pizan's time, or today, is to really debunk the arguments that are being used against women.
Which honestly, you gotta respect, because I don't know if I could do that after seeing like how dumb these arguments can get. I don't know if I could, like, day after day just keep debunking them, because at some point I just throw my hands up being like, you guys are fucking dumb. So props to the perseverance.
Yeah. And to kind of go off on this, I think to McClung's credit, she's kind of gotten really good. She's been doing this for decades at this point. By the time this article comes out, she's managed rhetoric really well, right? Where she knows what arguments are going to be coming her way, and is kind of preempting them in a sense, and almost what's the term I'm looking for in this case? Appeasing men's egos, I think, in this essay, or at least it feels like it. And when I wrote this one in the notes, but this is on page 534 of the version that we had, was that she doesn't suggest that men, quote, that women, quote, usurp men's place in the world, right? But that instead she asks, in this case specifically, that white educated women be granted the right to vote and full citizenship, which would be granted by 27. And, you know, yes, it was quite radical at the time, but she does nevertheless appease men. She's like, don't worry, chill, have your cup of tea. We're not going to take your place, right? That's not what we want. We just want to be able to actually discuss or at least engage with these ideas in the political sphere like you, but we do not want to replace you because that would be absurd, right? In a sense. And obviously different arguments would come later on in the 20th century, but from where she's standing, it was obviously quite radical as she was explaining
Yeah,
it. Mhm.
and you know, Pizan and a bunch of other women who were after her as well. There was a bit of a dead air in terms of quote unquote feminist discourse until the 17th century, but the 1700s. But this kind of rhetoric of saying we're not here to replace you, we just want like a place without replacing you is kind of like these really like tiptoe arguments that you see a lot at the time and before then as well of saying that there is a certain sense of individuality in women as well as being these capable people but who also recognize their responsibilities as mothers, as women of the home. And whether you agree with that or not, I think it's important also to consider the position of women at the time, right? You were talking, Patrick, about the fact that until a certain point, women were considered wards of the state and wards of their husband. They did not belong to themselves, right? So there was a certain idea that women were uh, incapable of taking care of themselves and doing things for themselves in an independent fashion.
But they
And
still
so,
had to be the ones to take care of children. That's always going to be the fun kicker.
yeah, but I think there's also this interesting and very strategic argument that's being made here by women to go carefully and to go in stages of how they want to think about their position. Because I wouldn't be surprised that women like McClung or Pizan or even Shulamit Firestone, who absolutely gave zero shits in her book about the position of women in the home, she's like, no way, we should just eradicate the family, period. But that's another question. Um, but these women had these very radical notions of women's positions, as you say, Patrick. And whether we consider them radical today, they were radical then. And I wouldn't be surprised that these women also thought, well, I think that women have proven and can show that they are capable of being more than what society prescribes them to be, aka mothers. And it's not to say that being a mother is not a difficult job or that it's not a difficult aspect of someone's life. However, that we are also capable of doing much more than only this. Not to say just this, but only. But I don't think that at the time stating that women could be business owners would have benefited the feminist movement in any way because they would have been laughed out of any court or any of any parliament because it was just not within the mentality. It was not conceived in that way.
Yeah, and it's only I think this was published in the year, I'd have to look at the date specifically, in the year that women were allowed to enter legislation, actually, or the Legislative Assembly in Manitoba specifically, so where McClung is writing from. And it would have been right around this time that in other prairie provinces and in other provinces more generally, that right would have been gained. Again, Quebec would be late to the party as usual, but the I do think it's interesting, and I have a few more quotes that I pulled out here that support your argument in this case of there are certain limits in this case. So, for example, the concession that men are stronger than women, and that doesn't, and that in that sense, there are certain jobs that are definitely fitted for men in that sense. So the idea of where women lay in the workforce is definitely at the forefront of McClung's mind, where she says, there is not really much argument in pointing out that women cannot lay bricks nor string electric wire and therefore can never be regarded as man's equal in the matter of citizenship. Right? She's again kind of doing this interesting rhetorical device where she's saying like, I'm not going to lay a brick, which today, obviously looking back on it 100 years later, we're like, I mean, you could, but okay, honey. But the idea here being is like, just because we don't want to do that doesn't mean that we're not a participant in society, right? And that doesn't mean that what you do is more important necessarily just because you do something different. And you see that as well with what she says about the fact that women are already in the workforce. And she points to a statistic, I don't know where she got it, that 30% of adult women of Canada and the United States are wage earners, and their percentage grows every day, which is, I think, an interesting thing to keep in mind in this case. I think it would go down, like Max said, after the wars in the 50s and then go back up. But yeah, generally speaking, it would, that's two important points. Yeah, Camille, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add like a little thing that I thought about. I don't have a direct quote for this, but I know that Pizan does actually mention this in her book, the book of the City of Ladies, where she recognizes again today ladies who are stronger than men. That happens. We're not saying otherwise, but that at the time Pizan recognized that men were stronger than women physically, but she also made that little quip where, that doesn't change the fact that intellectually we could be more intelligent than you are, or that, you could be smarter, or that we are of equal intelligence. And that her question here was not to discuss physical attributes. And she rejected, I think, that right at the beginning of the book. Like, please stop saying that it's because you're physically stronger. That makes absolutely no sense as an argument for us to be active participants, because society is an intellectual exercise, not a physical one. And she had mentioned also, like a little bit later, on how this was a question of the soul, and comes back to this idea of virtue that the temperance movement actually brought up, is that we're thinking here about the soul, which is not of the body, but of spiritual interests as well as intellectual interests. And that's how she was able to make her argument. And then you see this here, 500-ish years later, where McClung is kind of making the same argument, is that it doesn't mean that I can't lay a brick, that I can't vote.
Did you want to add anything, Mac? Or
It reminds me of modern discourse we have around like women in jobs or whatever, because we get that discourse now. It's like, oh, women want equal rights, so they can do all the horrible jobs too, blah blah. It's like, okay, but that has nothing to do with this right now. Like, this all seems in practice. And if we want to talk on that route, then let's get men into more, let's see how you have men doing more traditional feminine roles and jobs. Like, let's see how these men do handling a bunch of newborn babies as nurses, which they do. Like, there are male nurses for sure, but it's still predominantly seen as this. Let's have men take over a classroom in elementary school. Like, I want to see these male kindergarten teachers. Then, like, the discourse that McClung is highlighting, that was also highlighted 500 years earlier. Like,
but more interestingly, and this is an obvious argument to make, how are these male figures who are actively participating in the role of parent or kindergarten teacher
they're heroes.
or nurse?
They're heroes.
They're heroes, yeah. But women are still viewed as
Meanwhile, if a
just
woman
doing
did
what they're
become a
supposed
trash
to do.
lady, she would be like, oh, she's a trash lady. Huh, she just has to take
Yeah.
herself out then.
And I think that would be extremely frustrating for writers like McClung and Pizan, just like, guys, what the fuck are you doing? Like, really? Really? But again, this is a bit of an obvious argument, because this is an argument that you hear all the time in pop culture feminism. But I just wanted, seemed fitting to put it here.
I don't want to end on a bit of a downer, but I do think it is important to note, we've kind of been alluding to this throughout, that a major part of McClung's project, right, was as a eugenics proponent, right? And I'm wondering, Camille, you kind of mentioned this in the notes that you took, but where this fits in within the wider project of suffragism, or the suffragists at the time, right? Because, I think the obvious reason, and I don't know if there's anything to add on to this case, right, is that there's an underlying assumption that you have to have a certain level of intelligence and a certain level of capabilities in society in order to have the right to vote, right? And the racial element is, of course, quite an easy target in this case, especially the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, when these kinds of ideas were very, very widespread, unfortunately. And I just want to mention that this is a thing. Like, we've been we're talking about McClung in a rather positive light, I feel here, and that's fine. I do think it's deserved in some sense. But I do think that this is another element that we should at least underline, that she was a real racist in this case. And there's no two ways to put it in this case. It's just like very straightforward racism. And I don't know if you had anything to say about this in particular, about her work or about her project, but I do think it's important to mention in this case. Yeah.
But I mean, to comment on that, I think you said it, Patrick, that the fact that she was a big proponent of eugenics and that she believed in these ideas meant that, I come back to this word, comes back to the exclusion of Black women. It comes to the exclusion of the labor force. It comes to the exclusion of sex workers. It includes the rejection of any woman who was not white and who was not born of a good family, who was not at least middle class. And of course, this is extremely problematic, but I think that the right question here to ask, and perhaps as a follow-up to this episode, is to look at a Black feminist writer in Canada, or at least in the US, to see how do they respond to this kind of rhetoric, and how do they fight against these arguments to create an argument that is more inclusive, or perhaps more fitted to the situation that they have to go through as Black women because of the fact that they are being rejected from society according to eugenic
or even
ideals, that their skulls were not the right size, or that they were clearly, because they were African Canadians, that they were not intelligent enough to be able to kind of exercise any kind of discourse in the feminist or racial spheres. And so it's not to say, like, of course, McClung, being a racist and being someone who believes in eugenics, has big holes in her arguments, holes that need to be addressed. But instead of addressing it simply from looking at her perspective and saying, well, she sucks because of it, to look at how Black
I'm going to
writers
disregard
have
everything
fought
else
against
she
it.
ever said.
Right.
Just because of
Yeah. I don't know, Max, did you have anything to add? Because I do have something to add on to like the racialized women after, but yeah, go ahead.
Yes, well, and I think Cammie's on the right track. And I think even more, because we're in Canada, so I think we would also have to talk in regarding especially First Nations women and the treatment that way from a eugenics perspective, and how it's the weird way, of treating them like a separate species, putting them on reserves. I think
Absolutely.
I don't know, I would just be repeating what Cam said at this point. So I'm just going to say I agree with Cam.
So I do think you bring up an interesting point, and that's why I decided to end on other women that wrote, if you look in the notes on page 5, like on other women, not that they don't deserve
doing the work. Good
episodes.
job, Patrick. Round of applause for
Hell
Patrick.
yeah.
What a feminist. Doing a lot for the feminist movement, this white man.
No, but so for example, we already talked about Machar, but Marianne Shadd was a prominent abolitionist, an African American, and she would later come to Canada in this case and write a lot when she lived in Canada, where she wrote, for example, A Plea for Emigration. She was an education reformer and newspaper publisher. She published one of the first Black newspapers in Canada, right? The other notable people who we've talked about on the show as well, E. Pauline Johnson is notable as an Indigenous woman. She was Mohawk in this case, who did hold a lot of these ideas to heart, even though she didn't necessarily express them publicly, which is obviously something that we can deconstruct of, like, what you can say publicly or not. And finally, another one that I know very little about, but I've heard of, is Edith Maud Eaton, who also wrote under the name Sui Sin Far, who was a Chinese English woman in this case, and who wrote in Canada in favor of Chinese rights in this case, and women's rights as well. One of the unfortunate situations, however, is that a lot of these racialized minorities, the substantial amount of their work would come later than the 19th century, right? Not that they didn't exist. Obviously, the names I just mentioned were some of the people that wrote, and the ideas were certainly there, right? But if we take, for example, African Canadians, right, a lot of what they were advocating for were civil rights, and which included the vote, right? But it kind of fits in, it ties back into what we were talking about earlier, right? That a lot of the concerns for these people was actually just being recognized as full people and full citizens. And the vote was a part of that, but it was not the entirety of that, right? And so a lot of the things that they would write would have a racial component to it rather than a specifically feminist component to it. And also one of the unfortunate things to mention is that a lot of people were limited by the education that they had as racialized people, and they were also very much limited by economically what they were able to print, right? And what kind of technologies had access to them. So it is, I think your point is very well taken, Kemi, but it's also important to recognize that unfortunately there are limitations for the time that we need to acknowledge in this case, which I'm sure you know, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners know in this case, but I just want to mention that it's something that we unfortunately have to keep in mind. Yeah.
But then this is why we do a part 2 to this, and we talk about at least one of those writer, and then part 3 talk about another writer who was a racial minority, so that we get
This is
a
our
sense of what
feminism
was
for the
happening.
year, okay? We've met our quota. The part 2 will come out next.
No, it won't. Not if I have a say, and I do.
That's true.
Do
Pam
you
is the
now?
one Patrick gets near full from.
No, but we can do that. It would be interesting. I would have to see, but might be able to do a part 2 in this case and talk about. Say it always depends on how much resources we actually have access to and are able to pull together for an episode. But I'm sure we could do at least another full episode about like racialized women in this case. That's definitely for sure. You can do a whole episode on Marianne Shadd on her own, but it might be interesting to just. I don't know
Or
if you could do
Johnson.
Johnson is good, but like I said, we already talked about her in another episode, so we can at least take more time for other people and at least mention Johnson at the very least, or re-mention her. But yeah, we've already been going on for almost like 2 hours at this point, and that's great. But were there any like final thought that you had about this particular movement? We didn't actually talk about the securing of rights just because we're going to be doing that later in this case, or at least in terms of
next year,
the voting rights in the 20th century. But yeah, was there anything that you wanted to like finalize thoughts on? Because I think we touched about a lot in this case.
We tested a lot. I'm happy for it though. I loved it. This was all so much great discussion and so much learning. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the show.
Oh,
it was a very interesting conversation.
I think
you want to be back on the show to talk about racialized women.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to come back for a part
Let's
2.
have
I think
3 white
it would
people
be
talk
important.
about racialized. Woohoo!
I think we should have another guest who is not white here. But I would be happy to come back on the show and have a discussion. And I feel also it would be important on my part to address it just because I've only spoken about white women here. And I think just for everyone's education, my own included, it's important to just address that. So yes, but I think we should have another woman on the show for that second part that is interested in intersectional understandings of feminism of Black or Indigenous women.
Yeah.
Take it away, Patrick.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you like the show, please consider supporting us. Historia Canadiana is supported by listeners like you. But no, seriously, if you want to chuck in a buck, you can always do so on Patreon. If you want to chuck in $3, you get access to an extra episode a month that's led by Mac, and it's always oodles of fun in this case. And we talked about
always a banger.
Yeah, it's always a banger. We talked about Portia White on the last episode.
Yeah, if you want to talk about feminism in Canada and racialized feminism, there we go. An episode on Portia White, 2 white dudes talking about a Black singer.
Absolutely.
Standard things.
Just
Justin Trudeau things.
Just Justin Trudeau. But yeah, honestly, what we're always interested in, of course, is hearing what you have to say about the episode. If you've somehow made it to the 2-hour mark of this episode, fantastic. Let us know what you thought, either about the people that we're talking about our opinions, about anything of the sort, and let us know. We might share it on the show in this case. But the best way that you can help the show grow is just by leaving a review and telling your friends about it. It really helps, and it gets Canadian history to more people's ears in this case. So that's always fun. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers it for today. Thank you very much, Camille, for having joined us from our living room. And we'll see you all next time on another episode of Historia Canadiana. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Hope you
Bye.
find your feminism.